Saturday, September 7th, Brooklyn, New York. It's MSNBC Live Democracy 2024, our premier live audience event. Maddow, Psaki, Mitchell, Reed, Hayes, Steele, Menendez, Sanders-Townsend, O'Donnell, Wagner, Rule, Melber, Kornacki, and more. Join the MSNBC community in conversation. Visit msnbc.com/democracy 2024 to buy your tickets today.
Hi there, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in the East. Where there's smoke, there's usually fire. And the repeated denials of any connection between the radical manifesto written by the Heritage Foundation to send America back to the 1800s and Team Trump are generating a whole lot of smoke. Now for the fire. Brand new reporting reveals that the very same people behind that radical manifesto, Project 2025, are also behind Trump's Republican Party and their official party platform. ABC News reports this, quote, in May, the Trump campaign and the RNC announced their platform committee leadership team, the senior officials tasked with drafting the Republican platform. And they named Russ Vought as the platform committee's policy director and Ed Martin as deputy policy director. Both have ties to Project 2025. And as we reported on this program yesterday, Vought was a former Trump administration staffer, which brings us to the wider point. If you want to look at what Trump and his allies plan to do in a second Trump term, look at what they sought to do in the first. A key plank of Project 2025 is a total transformation of the way the Justice Department has functioned since the very beginning. It calls for the undoing of the central tenet of the Department of Justice, its independence from politics. Project 2025 calls to, quote, ensure the assignment of sufficient political appointees throughout the Department of Justice. That means purge experienced career law enforcement officials, replace them with appointees who will do whatever Donald Trump asks. Experience, merit, ability to pass a background check, none of that will happen. None of that will matter. The only qualification for serving in Trump's DOJ, loyalty and acquiescence to Trump. And as Trump has repeated over and over and over again, a key priority for his second term will be, in his words, retribution and revenge. That means more people will have harrowing experiences like our next guest, Michael Cohen, had. Michael Cohen was sent back to prison, notably 4 years ago today, in a move a judge deemed retaliatory for refusing to back off publishing a book about Donald Trump. It's where we start the hour with the aforementioned Michael Cohen, host of the Mea Culpa and Political Beatdown podcast, author of the books Disloyal and Revenge, How Donald Trump Weaponized the U.S. Department of Justice Against His Critics. Michael Cohen, it's great to see you.
Good to see you, Nicolle.
I feel like we are sort of sleepwalking into this false notion that what Trump promises in a second term is new. It's not. It's what he successfully did in a first term, which is to prosecute and jail people who threaten him, people he deems his rivals or opponents, people like you. Tell us what happened 4 years ago today.
People like you too, Nicolle, and the president of your MSNBC station. Donald has been very clear about his enemies list. And there are many people on it, including folks like Mark Zuckerberg. What they did is they lured me down to 500 Pearl Street, and they provided me, and I showed this on your program a couple of weeks back. They presented myself and a friend of mine who's a lawyer, Jeffrey K. Levine, who I asked to join me because something just seemed terribly amiss. And they gave us this 2-page document that is filled with syntax and grammatical and spacing errors. And the very first paragraph is a complete and total violation of my First Amendment constitutional right, in that it prohibited me from speaking to the media, publishing a book, doing television, anything, including friends and family were supposed to be warned not to discuss anything to do with me because it would glamorize a federal inmate who is on confinement status. It was an absolute ridiculous paragraph, again, that was drafted for me. And how do we know this 2-page document was drafted for me? Because it does not contain a federal identifiable number to it, whereas the real one clearly does. Well, when I refused to sign it, and asked that they tamp down the language because my book, Disloyal at the time, was already with the printer. What they did is instead, they had a guy named Patrick McFarland, who's an RRM over at a residential reentry manager over at MDC Correctional Facility, sign a remand order, and they had me taken into custody by 3 marshals who handcuffed and shackled me. And I say this not in order to glamorize what happened to me, but really to send a message to the American people, something I've been yelling from the rooftops, from every single platform that I can, that my biggest fear is that what they did to me, they will do to you. Donald already has a blueprint of what he needs to do, and that's weaponizing the Department of Justice, weaponizing government, which he said he was also going to do. Every person that works in government will be working not for the United States government, but for him. And they will be required to sign a loyalty pledge to him, meaning there will be no opportunity to file, as I did through my other lawyer, Danya Perry, a habeas corpus petition that had me released from the 16-day solitary confinement, bringing it to a total of 51 days of solitary confinement. Nobody will have that option again if Donald Trump ends up in the White House.
What impact, I mean, you know the inside of his brain in terms of his desire to stay just on the other side of criminality, to stay out of jail, to avoid what Chris Christie used to say, the clink of the door. The Supreme Court wiped away that check on his worst impulses by granting him absolute immunity. What do you think he's capable of?
Absolutely anything and everything. You allow your mind to wander into the farthest level of dystopia, and then you will finally get a small glimpse into just how far that he will push this. Look, I want to be clear about this. What he did to me is absurd. It made me the very first political prisoner held by my own country, by the United States of America, for refusing to waive my First Amendment constitutional right. The Supreme Court decision just gave him immunity from prosecution on this by claiming, and you'll have to do it on an ad hoc basis, by claiming that this was a presidential act, that it was done in furtherance of the office of presidency. There is no limit to what he and his sycophants that will be there in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue will be successful in at least attempting to do.
Michael, he's talked about a televised military tribunal for Liz Cheney. People laugh it off. What do you think when you hear that?
I tell you not to laugh. There is not, first of all, there's nothing funny about it. There's nothing funny about a man who is seeking the highest office in our land, who would, in essence, again, be the most powerful person on the planet. And he's talking about military tribunals. He's talking about public executions. He's talking about using SEAL Team 6 within which to go into round up his political enemies and opponents and in jail, incarcerate them the way that he wants them to do it. Now, in order to help to stop this sort of movement, tomorrow, in fact, in the morning, my lawyers are going to be filing a writ of certiorari to the Supreme Court of the United States in order to hear the case Michael Cohen versus United States of America. Because in that case, that's the habeas corpus petition that Judge Alvin K. Hellerstein deemed that the actions of Trump, the administration, Bill Barr, DOJ was retaliatory. I don't think people understand the term enough, and I don't think it gets enough play. Certainly not by this White House, that's the Biden White House. It was retaliatory by an evil and vindictive individual who will seek to do this again and again and again and again because of the Supreme Court decision. He will have unlimited authority and power. Whether it's true or not, he will feel that he does, and he will take advantage of every single avenue that he possibly can. And my statement that I say to everyone, including Joe Biden and his family, including Hunter Biden, including you, including Mark Zuckerberg, including Elon Musk, including members of the Supreme Court themselves, be warned. Be very warned.
Say more. Be warned of what? I mean, it's in Project 2025. What people get wrong is how far he got in a first term. You were imprisoned. Andy McCabe was investigated. Jim Comey, with the wise counsel of David Kelly, a frequent guest on this program, especially during the Trump trial in New York, was his lawyer for years as he was under criminal scrutiny. The IRS carried out 2 incredibly invasive investigations into Andy McCabe and Jim Comey. There were wiretaps on Adam Schiff's phone. There were wiretaps on journalists from the New York Times. And that's just what we found out about at the end. Say more about what exactly he would do and to whom.
Well, to who will be anybody that creates some ire, whether you say something derogatory, whether you try to speak truth to power, whatever it is that you do, you're going to have to think twice about whether or not it is worth it for you to speak this truth to power, or to write about this truth to power, or to report about this truth to power, for fear, for absolute fear that in the middle of the night, SEAL Team 6 shows up to your home, knocks down your door, bags you, tags you, and sends you someplace like to Guantanamo Bay. A lot of people make fun of Donald Trump and they say, oh, this is all hyperbolic. It's nonsense. He's not sending SEAL Team 6. He's going to send MEAL Team 6 to come in to deliver a Mar-a-Lago burger. No, there's nothing funny here. There's no joking around. We are on the brink of losing our democracy, our democratic republic, because the man has absolutely figured out what it's going to take in order to dismantle our democratic system, our democracy, to dismantle the Constitution. So when he tells you, not me saying it, not you, Nicolle, when Donald Trump tells you that he intends to destroy our tripartite system of government, he's going to do away with the legislative branch and the judiciary and confer all power onto himself through the executive branch. I don't know why there is a single person in America, regardless of Republican, Democrat, or Independent, that is willing to turn around and to lose this 249-year experiment that is the beacon of the world. It is everything that everybody wants to be. We are the beacon that shines brightest on top of the mountain. These folks are willing to give this up to a man who is a con man, as the Al Jazeera article put it. This is a guy who makes the guy who was selling the Brooklyn Bridge and the other bridges, 100 years ago, makes him look like a novice, like a baby. He is no baby. He knows exactly what he's doing. And my warning to everyone again, all right, be scared, be nervous, and make sure, if you really do care about democracy, that you are fully registered to vote come November, and you vote Democrat straight down the ballot.
Michael Cohen, I feel like there's one more thing that I want to have you sort of explain and articulate. And that is, as someone who was once under the Trump umbrella, what is the lure? Why do you think Trump is ahead in just about every battleground state?
Yeah, first of all, I don't know if all those polls are exactly accurate. You don't know how people are going to react when they are alone with their conscience. If you are a woman, or if you are the spouse, or you have a daughter, or you have a niece, or there's a woman in your life, maybe your mom, that you actually care about, and you want to preserve a woman's right to choose her own reproductive decision making. How do you vote for the guy who has the 900-plus page manifesto that says that this should be a reenactment of The Handmaid's Tale, that this should go back to some white Christian nationalist ideology? I don't understand how that happens. So you will be by yourself in a voting booth, making a decision that doesn't just affect you, but it affects many generations to come. So why are people in the spell? It's such a great question. What he does is he speaks like a popularist. And there's a lot of disenfranchised people in this country. They feel dejected and rejected by the system, that they're having hard times. Many of them also happen to just be racist, and that they are they are fearful of brown and black people because they want to continue with their white privilege, and they feel that that's being lost as well. There's a multitude of reasons why people are joining this Trump cult, why they stay with it, despite the fact that they have these racist, sexist, misogynistic tendencies, these xenophobic, homophobic, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic tropes and beliefs. I don't have an answer to it, but I will tell you what took me out of it, and took me out very quickly, was the notion I'm going to jail for another man's dirty deeds. And you may remember I said to George Stephanopoulos that my wife, my daughter, my son, and my country have my first loyalty and always will. And I'm saying to each and every one of your listeners, including the ones that are actually Republicans or MAGAs, your loyalty belongs to your family and to your country. And you need to make sure that Donald Trump never gets anywhere near the front door of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Clear and powerful ringing of the bell from you, my friend. Michael Cohen, let's make this a regular thing. Thank you for starting us off today.
Anytime. Thanks, Nicolle.
Thank you. Let me, before we get to break, let me just quickly bring in former U.S. Attorney, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Harry Litman, and Chief Political Columnist, host of the podcast In Politic for Puck, MSNBC National Affairs Analyst John Heilemann. John Heilemann, I feel like we as a media are so slow to adapt to how quickly Trump moves the Overton window, and what was the terrain of extraordinary investigative journalism during the first Trump term, which was figuring out what he was really trying to get Jeff Sessions and then Bill Barr and Rod Rosenstein to do, is now in the Republican Party platform, right? Politicizing DOJ and using it for political prosecutions and persecutions is now the RNC position on a website out loud. And it is part of normalizing it so that when it happens, there's this moment where people say, well, we knew this was going to happen, right? This isn't new. No. This is new. This is not normal. And this is absolutely what he plans to do.
Right. And, I think it's one of the liberating, I'm saying this ironically, but it's one of the liberating things about becoming a convicted felon is, once you're lawless, once you're officially in the realm of the lawless, you're kind of freed of all obligation to still be lawful, at least in your mind, if you're Donald Trump. And Nicolle, people have forgotten that, Trump was so new. The things he was willing to do were so new, were so far outside the realm of any historic precedent in the presidency that it was a heroic thing that journalism did in that period when he was in office. Because all of it was new. No one had really an experience seeing anything quite like that before. And a lot of it was happening in the shadows, right? In 2020, and this is the part that people forget, there was no Republican platform in 2020. I mean, Donald Trump had a convention where they just said there will be no platform. Whatever Trump says is the party platform. It was the ultimate, le parti c'est moi. He was the platform. And that again made it difficult because, there was some effort there to hide the ball. Now there is no effort to hide the ball. It's all there and it's all out in front of us. And so it boasts the responsibility of journalists and all citizens, frankly, to get their heads around what he's proposing. It makes it all that much higher, the responsibility. But in some sense, it makes it easier because he is really doing us the favor. And I say that somewhat ironically, but not totally. He's doing us the favor of basically saying, you want to call me a criminal? Fine. Hold my beer. Here's the new stuff I'm going to do that is how far I'm willing to go now that I'm kind of the Jesse James of Republican or national politics. We can see it. The only question is what we're going to do about it.
Well, and Justice Sotomayor writes, Harry Litman in her dissent, that, or I think it's Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, that warns of the White House becoming a seat of criminal conduct. The Supreme Court greenlit that. That's what they have ushered in. I mean, they don't live on an hermetically sealed island where they don't know who the actors are. The case was Donald Trump versus the United States of America. What should people be prepared for?
So they have greenlit it, and Trump didn't even need green lights before. He went through amber and red ones. John's is the stunning point. He's now trying to distance himself as Trump from the 972-page plan. And who knows, I doubt he's read even to page 2. But the big points of it, mainly the complete enemies list of anyone who's ever crossed him. And second, the absolute gutting of the civil servants, starting with DOJ, is just a manifest danger for what Michael Cohen said, but a whole long laundry list. And that is not even slightly hidden. And you're right. And I know we'll talk about this more, but the court has really greenlit it, or at least insulated it. And we are in some kind of serious situation here going into November.
Right, where the voters are truly the only people that can stop it if they don't like it. John and Harry, I need you to stick around much longer. When we come back, Donald Trump's assault on the rule of law in America rages on today. He's now trying to suppress any and all damaging evidence from his federal election subversion case before the 2024 election. We'll bring you that new reporting next. And with the RNC officially set on an anti-democracy, anti-voting 2024 agenda, we'll talk about what Republicans are doing at the state level to change the rules and rig as many wins as they can for Donald Trump. And in the next hour, President Joe Biden will deliver remarks for the 75th anniversary of NATO. That's ahead of major meetings with world leaders and a critical week for him and for the alliance as we know it ahead of November's election. All those stories and more when Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
Introducing MSNBC Premium on Apple Podcasts. Get early access to new original podcasts from MSNBC and ad-free listening to all of Rachel Maddow's chart-topping, award-winning original series, including Season 1 and Season 2 of Ultra, Bagman, and Deja News, plus exclusive bonus content and new episodes of The Rachel Maddow Show and Morning Joe ad-free. Subscribe to MSNBC Premium on Apple Podcasts.
Brand new reporting reveals that the presumptive Republican nominee for president is plotting another cover-up of his role at the heart of one of the darkest episodes in recent American history, the deadly Capitol insurrection. Team Trump now trying to wash away what is an indelible stain on Trump's presidency as he asked the American people to send him back to the White House. The Guardian reporting this, quote, Donald Trump is expected to launch a new legal battle to suppress any damaging evidence from his 2020 election subversion case from becoming public before the 2024 election, preparing to shut down the potency of any mini trials where high-profile officials could testify against him. These so-called mini trials are the result of the Supreme Court ruling that Trump is immune from prosecution for official acts, even if those official acts were done in furtherance of a coup plot. They are evidentiary hearings that are intended to determine how much of special counsel Jack Smith's indictment of Donald Trump in the federal election case remains intact. As legal expert Norm Eisen put it, quote, it's going to put some of the most disturbing elements of the attempted coup on trial for the American people, for the court and the American people to consider. In theory, that could potentially include witnesses, Trump's own Vice President Mike Pence, or his former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, for example. No surprise, then, that Donald Trump would be desperate to prevent these hearings from ever happening. Also from The Guardian, quote, in the coming months, Trump's lawyers are expected to argue that the judge can decide whether the conduct is immune based on legal arguments alone, negating the need for witnesses or multiple evidentiary hearings. If prosecutors with the special counsel Jack Smith's office press for witnesses such as former Vice President Mike Pence or White House officials to testify, Donald Trump's lawyers are expected to launch a flurry of executive privilege and other measures to block their appearances. And as for the central issue at these hearings, what conduct is covered under the Supreme Court's definition of presidential immunity, Team Trump will reportedly argue, in effect, that a coup is okay as long as the president of the United States does it. Once again, from The Guardian, quote, Trump's lawyers are expected to argue the maximalist position that they considered all of the charged conduct was Donald Trump acting in his official capacity as president and therefore presumptively immune and incumbent on prosecutors to prove otherwise. This incredibly consequential legal battle is expected to start next month when Judge Tanya Chutkan regains control of the case. Let's bring in the journalist behind the scoop, senior political correspondent for The Guardian, Hugo Lowell, bylined on that reporting. John and Harry are back with us. Hugo, tell us more.
Yeah, look, I think Trump world knows that the evidence that could come out of these hearings could be politically really damaging, but also legally damaging, right? I mean, there is the political element because the stuff about January 6th and Trump's efforts to overturn the election don't play well with voters. We know that. We see that in the polls. But there's also a legal element here, which is if prosecutors can put up some of the best witnesses they have in front of Judge Chutkan and have them testify that no, Trump was acting in his capacity as a candidate and not the president, well, it could make prosecutors' life easier in terms of overcoming that presumptive immunity. And so they have found a way, kind of they're planning still, but they have found a way to get through this in their eyes, and that is to launch this two-pronged attack. One, to say that we don't need hearings at all, and if we do need hearings, we can do it only on legal arguments. We will be dry, boring legal arguments, and it will be kind of hypotheticals that the lawyers raise in court. And if Jack Smith really presses for witnesses, then they know they have a bigger problem and they are expecting to launch a flurry of executive privilege motions. They want to say to the judge that the record is anew and that the previous decisions before the grand jury investigation are not binding and that she needs to litigate the privilege issues anew. And I think that's going to be the cornerstone of Trump's effort to make sure that none of the really damaging evidence gets before the public before November.
Harry Litman, will it work?
It might. The Supreme Court opinion is not only incredibly broad in its basic articulation of the immunity principle, Nicolle, but it also contains these mines and sinkholes of other principles. Here's a very big one. You may not have evidence of immune conduct to prove even your unofficial and non-immune case. So I know there are a lot of people, close colleagues of ours, are enamored of this mini trial idea, but there's a circularity in the court opinion. Jack Smith says, I call Mike Pence to the stand because I want to establish that this was in fact non-immune. And Trump says, wait a second, that you are not allowed to give any evidence of immune conduct. Stop the music. You must decide it first. What does Chutkan do now? And remember, this is immunity, meaning there is always interlocutory appeal. So I think at a minimum, there is grist for Trump to try to block it and then take appeals from it and to keep what exactly Hugo's talking about, which is evidence. Yes, they can do it on the allegations, and that's part of what the court talked about in the case, but can they actually bring Pence to the stand or Pat Cipollone or anyone of that nature when the court has said you can't present evidence of immune conduct to prove this case? I think there's a whole kind of obstacle course that the court has set up even before you get to that point, and it is damn tricky.
John Heilemann, Michael Cohen said something in the first block. He said, vote for Democrats up and down the ballot if you don't like this. I mean, this Supreme Court has given the pro-democracy, pro-rule of law coalition such grist, right? Because I don't really understand all of the legal things being batted around and weaponized by Trump. But it is clear that Donald Trump on live TV had his supporters go to the Capitol, beat cops with sticks, endangered the life of Mike Pence, and he's going to get away with it. And I feel like for 8 years, we've covered efforts by the federal criminal justice system, Mueller and SDNY and Jack Smith and Tanya Chutkin and Aileen Cannon to hold him accountable. And it's a giant goose egg, not a nothing zero. No one's coming to save anyone from Donald Trump's criming except the voters. What does this, in your view, look like if successfully argued as a political issue?
Well, I first want to say, Nicolle, you and I we both have exactly the same amount of legal training, which is to say none. But I think that we both have wandered around politics and the intersection of politics and law long enough to adduce one important way of thinking about this, which is that the Supreme Court's really screwed us, you know. And I think that's the bottom line here. It's amazing that how one decision with it written the way that Harry just described, well, with the landmines that it's kind of strewn around, the trapdoors, beyond just the headline of it, you know, the way in which it's kind of having this kind of metastatic kind of effect on all of these potential prosecutions and efforts at legal accountability is really incredibly dispiriting. And I think it's particularly dispiriting for those of us who saw in 2020 how, you know, after 4 years of banging at the guardrails of American democracy and plowing through a lot of those guardrails and showing us all how actually fragile the system of democratic rule and democratic accountability that is America actually was, we all looked up and said, well, man, you know, I'll tell you what, the courts held. Thank God the courts held, you know, because Trump, you know, waged all these lawsuits trying to prove that the election was stolen, and he got knocked down in every single one of them. Republican judges, Democratic judges, Republican states, Democratic states. You know, we said, well, look, that's one guardrail that's still there, the judiciary. And as much as anything, what happened at the Supreme Court with this immunity ruling, it feels to me like the last guardrail has now been knocked down. And that's not to say that there aren't still judges who will uphold the rule of law. But when the Supreme Court knocks down the guardrail, that has these ripple effects across all of the rest of the judiciary, where judges who want to uphold the rule of law now have their hands tied or don't know how the Supreme Court's ruling affects them. And so now they're suddenly on uncertain ground. I know the politics of this, you know, it's a conversation for another day. I think on some level, though, watching this whole thing, it's as dispiriting to me in terms of the future of the democratic experiment in America. It's as dispiriting as really anything that's happened over the course of these last 6 or 7 years.
Right, because it's forever. I mean, a Supreme Court decision is binding until a new Supreme Court decision reverses this decision. It's done.
And we're going to have a conservative court for a very long time.
Yeah. Hugo, Lowell, thank you for inspiring this conversation with your tremendous reporting. We're grateful to get to talk to you about it. Harry Litman, thank you. While depressing, it was illuminating. Thank you very much. John Heilemann sticks around for more. Coming up for us, the dangerous game that Republicans are playing with our democracy and voting rights in America, starting at the state level, where they're trying to rig the election in Donald Trump's favor with new and arbitrary rules, even before anyone heads to the polls. That's next. Don't go anywhere.
Number one, I would look out for the positive pro-democracy stories, which are often in the states, you know, people in Idaho, or sorry, not Idaho, people in Ohio, or, you know, wherever it might be, gathering signatures for a referendum, people winning referenda, people trying to reverse gerrymandering. That's Ohio. The small fights where people are actually out there already trying to make things better, they don't get enough national coverage. And that kind of contributes to the general doom moment that we're in, where we all think, well, it's coming, maybe it's inevitable. That's not true. Like, there are lots of people who are unscripted and who are not attended to, who are actually fighting this fight.
A vital reminder from our friend Tim Snyder on this program yesterday that the fight for democracy is happening right now everywhere. If you look closely out in the states, from the ballot initiative in Ohio that he mentioned to try to put an end to gerrymandering, to the Department of Justice stepping in the state of Georgia to make it easier to vote absentee, each fight in response to Republicans' near constant and disingenuous attacks on voting rights predicated on the big lie. The RNC platform released yesterday doubles down on the Republican Party's anti-democracy, anti-voting agenda, vowing to implement ways to make voting harder, including voter ID laws and paper ballots. According to Democracy Docket's legislation tracker, quote, there's currently 60 anti-voting cases making their way through various courts in 21 states and the District of Columbia. The GOP itself has filed at least 40 active anti-voting lawsuits this election cycle, while the RNC has filed 9. Joining our conversation, voting rights attorney, founder of the site Democracy Docket, Marc Elias, is here. John Heilemann is still with us. Marc, I thought of you the minute Tim Snyder said there's all sorts of stuff happening in the States, and I thought, thank God you draw our attention to it. My worry, though, is that what's happening in the States is not a fair fight, right? Republicans, fueled by the lie that there was fraud in 2020 when there was none, have actually made a depressing amount of progress in making it harder to vote ahead of 2024. But do what Tim Snyder said. Give me something good.
Sure. So I'll start with something really good. My law firm won a case earlier this week in the state of Wisconsin, in the state Supreme Court, to restore drop boxes, right? So there had been ballot drop boxes in 2020. A conservative majority of that state Supreme Court then struck down or ruled that drop boxes were not legal in 2022. As you may recall, Democrats lost a close Senate race in that state in 2022. And now, as a result of the litigation we brought, drop boxes will be back in place for 2024. So that's just one example of the good news. But I could point to state after state after state where, democracy is on the docket and democracy is winning. And it doesn't mean we win everywhere, but it does mean that we win more places than people think. And it's important for everyone to recognize that the cynics want you to give up on the courts. The cynics want you to believe that it is inevitable that voter suppressors will win, that the election subverters will have their way. And it is our job to not just tell the truth about what's happening, which is not always very good news, but to also not bury the fact that we can make a difference when we fight.
Well, I mean, and the despair is a tool of the autocrat, as Ruth Ben-Ghiat constantly reminds me on this show, that it's not accidental that the party moving toward autocracy would like people to feel that there is no hope, and that hopelessness begets the hedging and the giving away power to an autocrat ahead of time. Marc, Elias, just weigh in on the conversation we've been having. We started with Michael Cohen, who describes his experience as sort of the first federal political prisoner of the Trump era, sort of patient zero. Your thoughts as the Project 2025 agenda morphs almost completely into Donald Trump's Republican convention platform committee?
Yeah, look, I think that if you have not read Project 2025, you probably have saved yourself a few hours better spent. But you should read a summary of Project 2025. Democracy Docket's got a good summary. A number of the news outlets have put out good summaries of Project 2025. But here is what they all basically say. Project 2025 is at its core a power grab, a plan for Donald Trump to seize the control of the entire executive branch. That means not just the Department of Justice, it means the IRS, it means the EPA, it means the SEC. He wants to seize control. They want to have a plan to seize control of the entire federal bureaucracy, replace career civil servants with political operatives, and then use that power to punish his enemies and reward his friends. It is a sort of cronyism writ large brought to the federal government. And that will lead to a lot of really bad policies, rolling back Roe versus Wade, rolling back, environmental laws and the like. But it will fundamentally reorder democracy. The day that Donald Trump becomes a dictator for a day, he becomes a dictator for life. And what Project 2025 does is it provides a competent plan. Remember, a lot of the conservative concern after 2016, after he won, was that he and his band of misfits were incompetent in seizing power. This is an effort to make them competent in seizing power, punishing his enemies, rewarding his friends, and frankly, not giving up power.
I mean, Heilemann, this is where the story is so different in a second term, because we were talking about the great journalism and how we were largely saved by a lot of those revelations. He was both incompetent and hemmed in by some people who still, Don McGahn had a note taker because he wanted to make sure that anything illegal he was asked to do was written down and preserved. Mark Milley had a red line, and it was, "I will not do anything illegal." Those sorts of guardrails would not exist.
Right. I remember, Nicolle, right after January 6th, in those first couple of months when there was a lot of, when people's eyes were opened as to what exactly, really fully opened as to what exactly the scale of Trump's ambitions were and the dangers of it. Somebody wrote a story that in one of the big name high-end magazines like the Atlantic or the New Yorker or something, it sort of said, there was a phrase that stuck with me, which was January 6th was a dress rehearsal, right? And it was kind of like, it wasn't just an attempted coup. It was a dress rehearsal. You run the play, you figure out what works, what doesn't work, and then you do it better the next time. You don't pull it off the first time. You get ready for act two, for the real thing. And that kind of, it was just a dress rehearsal, sort of applies to everything, I think, about Trump's first term, which is maybe it wasn't intended to be just a dress rehearsal, but effectively that's what it was. It was kind of for Trump and the people around him, crucially, whatever you think of Trump's mental capacity, the people around, he's got people around him who are not stupid, venal, evil, malcontents, malintended, all of the above, but everybody paid attention and they saw where the breaks were. They saw where the guardrails were, internal guardrails, external guardrails. They were largely incompetent at trying to execute a lot of the worst of the policies and procedures and violations that they wanted to undertake. But they learned. They are, like the rest of us humans, they're learning machines, and they were taking notes on, if we'd done it that way, we could have gotten away with it. If we had said this about it, if we'd not done that, if a different appointee was here, if a different appointee was there, if we had fired that person earlier, and that is now the kind of the game plan for what they plan to do going ahead. And it's why, everyone, I think there's a consensus for those of us who care about democracy that the second Trump term is so much more dangerous than the first Trump term because of the fact that they are going to be better at doing the stuff that's going to kill the country.
And central to having the opportunity to carry out their more competent efforts to end democracy is making sure to rig the electorate. We'll continue to press you, Marc, Elias, on how you're fighting against that effort. I have to sneak in a quick break. We'll all be right back. Don't go anywhere. We're back with Marc Elias and John Heilemann. Marc, I just want to deal with one of the sort of big lie, 3.0 or 4.0, whatever lie we're on, that's being put out there and give you a chance to talk about it. The GOP platform promises to secure elections this way. Quote, "We will implement measures to secure our elections, including voter ID, highly sophisticated paper ballots, proof of citizenship, and same-day voting." Democracy Docket writes this, debunking the myths surrounding non-citizen voting. First, it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. There's no concrete evidence that large numbers of non-citizens are voting. Second, these requirements do not just keep non-citizens from voting. They also stop eligible voters who don't have easy access to citizenship documents like passports and birth certificates. That's the most dangerous part for democracy. Jimmy Carter and Jim Baker looked at voter fraud after 2000. They didn't find any. Chris Krebs had to look at whether or not our elections were secure 20 years later in 2020 and described 2020 the, quote, most secure election in America's history. What is all of this really designed to do, in your view?
This is aimed at making it harder to vote and easier to cheat. And that is the Republican plan for 2024. They want to make it harder to vote because when you make it generically harder for everyone to vote, you make it particularly harder for people who have less experience voting, namely young voters. And also, the Republican Party has a shameful history that continues to this day of enacting voter suppression laws that target minority voters. In 2013, the state of North Carolina, controlled by Republicans, enacted a law that a federal Court of Appeals later found targeted African-American voters with near surgical precision. That was their words, not mine. If the Republican Party was doing that in 2013, you can only imagine what they were doing when North Carolina was passing laws in 2023 and 2024. So, these are all aimed at making voting generically harder. And they are also, though, setting up a structure to be able to cheat after the election, which is the second part of it. And here, I think John got it exactly right. My team and I litigated 65 cases for President Biden after the 2020 election against Donald Trump. We beat Donald Trump in all but one of those. We went 64-1. And, a lot of hay has been made making fun of the Republican lawyers like Rudy Giuliani, Jenna Ellis, Sidney Powell. My message to Democrats and my friends is that those are not the lawyers they're sending into court today. The lawyers they are sending into court today they may not be the best lawyers in the world, but they are much better lawyers. And they have learned from the humiliating errors that their predecessors made. And they are in state legislatures and in state capitals and in courtrooms around this country, advancing dangerous theories, both to make it harder to vote now, but to later claim, if Donald Trump loses, that there were illegal votes because of, this category, or the ballot stock was not secure, the paper, the sophisticated paper, whatever the hell that means, that there was early voting, there were drop boxes. They are setting up the arguments today to explain why after the election they want to say that these elections were not fair.
John Heilemann, you interviewed Jen O'Malley-Dillon, President Biden's campaign manager. What preparations are they engaged in for this period that Marc Elias is talking about, if any?
Well, I'll tell you that, Jen O'Malley-Dillon and I did not discuss that matter on that podcast, and we're short of time. But I did back in 2020, I remember doing an interview on The Circus with Bob Bauer on this very question about what,
yes,
because there was already concern in October of 2020. I'm certain and have heard in a general sense that the Biden campaign is very keyed in on the things that Marc's talking about and trying to make preparations. I think that as we get closer to Election Day, that is going to be a subject that is going to be raised a lot with them. There are going to be a lot of discussions, and a lot of reporters are going to be asking that question precisely in more detail, because I think, not just to say again what Marc said, but I do think this is an important part of the dress rehearsal, is what they have learned on the legal front. And I think the Biden campaign, which was very prepared in 2020, is going to have to be doubly or trebly prepared for it to happen again in 2024.
Marc Elias, John Heilemann, two of the best. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Coming up for us in the next hour, NATO members are meeting in Washington for what many fear could be the last time. We're awaiting remarks from President Joe Biden for the 75th anniversary of this great alliance, with a lot on the line for his campaign and for democracies all around the world. The next hour of Deadline White House starts after a very short break. Don't go anywhere.
He does not have a filter between his brain and his mouth. And so when he, for example, threatens to get out of NATO, as he did during his first term and has done since then, I think people better believe it. And I think that would be a catastrophic mistake for American national security and the security of the West as a whole.
Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock in the East. It's not an empty threat. Donald Trump's own former national security advisor says he will do it. He says his ex-boss's threats of pulling out of NATO are very real. The prospect of the disgraced ex-president and his autocratic impulses and now written agenda returning to the American White House looms large over this meeting, as leaders of the 32 NATO countries meet today to kick off a 3-day summit in Washington, D.C. President Joe Biden is expected to deliver remarks in this hour. We will bring them to you in their entirety as soon as they begin. President Biden will speak on NATO's 75th anniversary, an achievement for the alliance that has only grown stronger under Joe Biden's presidency. It has added 2 members, Finland and Sweden, in recent years, and it has helped its democratic ally, Ukraine, defend itself against a brutal war and invasion from Russia. That war, now nearly 2.5 years old, the importance of assistance from NATO members underscored by yet another heinous attack in Ukraine yesterday. Russian missiles hit a children's hospital in Kyiv, likely a war crime. For too long now, Ukrainian troops have continued to put up a real fight against the Russians. New York Times is reporting that U.S. officials say this, quote, Russia is unlikely to make significant territorial gains in Ukraine in the coming months as its poorly trained forces struggle to break through Ukrainian defenses that are now reinforced with Western munitions. The New York Times highlighting the significance of this week's meeting of NATO leaders to Ukraine's fight ahead. Quote, leaders at the summit are expected to promise new funding for Ukraine, announce plans for the alliance to coordinate weapons delivery, and strengthen a promise to Kyiv that it will eventually become a full ally. We're just moments away from President Joe Biden's remarks, a time for the president to assert himself and the U.S. on the world stage and reiterate support for Ukraine and democracies all across the globe. It's where we start the hour with some of our most favorite experts and friends. Co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy, Ian Bassin, is back with us, plus NBC News chief international analyst, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, Admiral James Stavridis is here, New York Times diplomatic correspondent Michael Crowley's here. Admiral, I start with you. Your thoughts, wherever they are today, as we get ready for this historic event and speech from President Biden.
Point one would be the value of NATO. We really ought to continue to celebrate it. And yes, there are some storm clouds in the form of a potential next president who decries this alliance. But can we just do the numbers for a minute? These are 32 nations, as you correctly point out, with the addition of 2 superb turnkey militaries in Sweden and Finland. 32 nations, well over 50% of the world's gross domestic product. U.S. defense budget, $800 billion. Second largest collective defense budget in the world is the rest of NATO, about $400 billion. And above all, Nicolle, these are the allies with whom we share our most cherished values. And so as I look at the NATO alliance, I was privileged to command for 4 years. And I think about the fact that NATO, the rest of NATO, came with us to Afghanistan after we were attacked. I wrote hundreds of condolence notes to the families of young Europeans who died under my command in Afghanistan, hundreds of them. So this is an alliance that is strong and is unified. And yes, there are challenges ahead about everything from defense spending to the potential return of shall we say, a skeptic in the form of Donald Trump. But overall, there's a lot to celebrate about NATO. I think that's what you'll hear President Biden do in this extremely important speech he's about to make.
Admiral Stavridis, I think Trump describes himself as more than a skeptic. His own former national security advisor says he would probably get out. What you're saying is important, though, about the condolence letters, because when Donald Trump first traveled overseas to Europe, his first trip actually wasn't to Europe, it was to Saudi Arabia. But when he first traveled to Europe, he refused at multiple speeches to affirm America's commitment to Article 5. Explain what that is and why that matters, and why the fact that we're the only country in NATO to actually ask anyone to come to our defense is such a backward read on Trump's part.
Yeah, the NATO treaty is incredibly short and elegant. You can read it in 10 minutes. The beating heart of that treaty, Nicolle, as you know, is Article 5, which says fairly simply that an attack on one nation will be regarded as an attack on all nations. And as you correctly say, and as I alluded to a moment ago, the only time in 75 years there's been a need to operationalize Article 5, it was after the U.S. was attacked on 9/11. The Europeans came with us, they fought with us, they died with us in Afghanistan. And yes, I am celebrating the alliance today, but I am very worried about the previous statements of Donald Trump, the team he has around him that are advising him. I think they have a inarticulate view of NATO. They don't see the value in it. And I'll conclude with this, Nicolle. Yes, we should be pushing the Europeans to collectively increase their defense spending to meet the 2% goal they've established. 23 out of the 32 nations are doing so. All of them need to do it. And given Russia and the extant threat there, it seems to me that that goal, that 2% ought to be raised to somewhere around 2.5%. U.S. spends 3.5% on defense. I'd like to see more out of our Europeans. But bottom line, this is an alliance that offers real value for the United States of America.
Ian, President Joe Biden has strengthened NATO. That is undeniable. But the autocratic alliance has also been strengthened. The first ever meeting between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un in North Korea has taken place. Viktor Orban has been shuttling between China and Russia. Just talk about the real power struggles set up for the next American president between autocracy and democracy.
Nicolle, we all know that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And I think this first quarter of the 21st century looks a lot like the first quarter of the 20th century in a couple of important ways. At the tail end of the Industrial Revolution, the late 19th, early 20th centuries, changes in how society functioned were incredibly disruptive to civilization, society around the world. And that disruption caused people across the world to run to the extremes of communism on the left, to the extremes of fascism on the right. And the contest in the early days of the 20th century was what form of government, what direction was going to dominate the 20th century. And thankfully, in large part because of American leadership, the winner of that battle was democracy. And the 20th century was democracy's century. And here we are now in the early days of the 21st century, and it's not the Industrial Revolution, it's the Information Revolution, which has upended society across the world. And once again, that disruption is causing civilizations the world over to look to extremes. And you see them rising across the world with extremist authoritarian movements coming from the right in places like Eastern Europe or Turkey or Russia, or coming from the left in places like Venezuela or China. And again, America is here at the center, deciding whether we will lead the 21st century to be an even stronger century for democracy, or whether, if Donald Trump has his way, we will join those rising forces of autocracy and make the 21st century one where autocracy is the order of the day. I think the stakes are nothing short of that.
Yeah, I mean, Ian, I'm glad you said that, because it feels like one of the tools or tactics of the authoritarian is to make us so scared and anxious we only focus inward. But this alliance is absolutely on the line, on the ballot, if you will, in November.
Yeah, look, NATO has been one of the key bulwarks and pillars that sustained the American century, the 20th century, in which a rules-based international order, where, as Admiral Stavridis said, our values of freedom and democracy were the dominant values in the world. NATO was part of upholding that. And I think it's telling and frightening that Donald Trump has made clear that that's not what he wants, that he wants to abandon that. And you've seen other corners of his MAGA world say about things like the U.S. Supreme Court, that they got the 20th century wrong, and they want to essentially repeal the 20th century. You see that domestically, and you see that being argued for internationally from Donald Trump and his allies. And I think that is the question that is frankly before the American voters in November, whether we want the 21st century to be one of freedom and democracy, or whether we want to go backwards on the 20th century and become a world that is governed by might and not by right.
Ian Bassin gets extra credit for having to speak over the beautiful sounds of the pomp and circumstance that is underway here at this historic event, the 75th anniversary of NATO. We are lucky to be joined by State Department spokesperson, our old friend, Matt Miller. Matt Miller, just jump into this conversation about the stakes and the import and the moment in which President Joe Biden addresses the NATO alliance.
Well, I think that's exactly what you're going to hear from the president tonight. So the place where he's giving this speech, the Mellon Auditorium here in D.C., is actually the location where the North Atlantic Treaty itself was signed 75 years ago. So what I think you'll see the president say tonight is to discuss the important role that NATO continues to play to keeping America safe, to keeping Europe safe. You know, NATO is the most important security alliance in the history of the world. For 75 years, it's kept us safe. It kept us safe from Russian aggression during the Cold War, and it continues to keep Europe safe from Russian aggression today. So you'll hear the president talk about the stakes for continuing to support NATO and why it's so important to do that. I think you'll also hear him talk a lot about what NATO has done to support Ukraine and what it continues to do to support Ukraine. Over the next few days during this summit, you're going to see significant new announcements from the United States and from our NATO allies and other partners about what we are doing to support Ukraine. And you'll hear some of those from the president tonight, including new announcements about what we're doing to provide Ukraine with air defense capabilities to help defend itself from the brutal Russian attacks like the one we saw on a children's hospital just yesterday.
You know, Matt, the Children's Hospital brought me back to the brutal slaughter of Ukrainian civilians in the town of Bucha, where the Western world, the free people saw those as brutal atrocities and war crimes. And Vladimir Putin was reported to have rewarded the soldiers who carried out those brutal attacks in Bucha. What is the president's view and the Secretary of State's view about sort of the competition for attention to the atrocities still being carried out on a near daily basis by Vladimir Putin in Ukraine?
Well, you know, sometimes the world does move on. There's a lot going on in the world, obviously, and it's hard for people to pay attention to everything at once. But I can tell you those of us in the government have not lost focus on Ukraine for 1 minute. We've continued to focus on getting the support to Ukraine that it needs. Obviously, we had a big fight in Congress to try to get the supplemental passed. That did ultimately pass, although much later than we would have preferred. And we have been surging military assistance to Ukraine since it passed. But even though we focus on military assistance, that's not the only assistance we're providing to Ukraine. We're providing economic assistance and diplomatic assistance. And some of the other work we're doing is work to help Ukraine stand on its own 2 feet. You'll see events here at the NATO summit to highlight the fact that around 24 countries have now signed long-term security agreements. So to help Ukraine plan a path for its future to defend itself from Russian aggression. We know that Russia isn't going away. Russia is going to be Ukraine's neighbor, as long as we can imagine. And so Ukraine's going to have to be able to defend itself against Russia for the foreseeable future. And we're helping Ukraine to do that.
Matt, you've been part of a lot of conversations at this virtual table, I guess, these days, since before your service in government. And, you know, we've spent a lot of time focused on the threat Donald Trump represents to the rule of law in America, to the norms. I think you were one to first mock our reliance on norms as inadequate when dealing with someone like Donald Trump. But the only people perhaps equally or maybe more worried about Donald Trump returning to the White House are our allies, our European allies. What kinds of conversations does the secretary have to reassure them?
So the secretary has a line he likes to say where he does policy, not politics, and I'm going to stick to that here. But obviously that in all of our conversations with our European allies and others, they pay attention to our elections, just as we pay attention to the elections of countries overseas. And I will say, as it comes to this conversation about Ukraine, one of the things that I think Vladimir Putin has bet on from the beginning is that the West would fracture, that the West would lose focus, that the West would stop supporting Ukraine and allow Russia to march unchecked through eastern Ukraine, through Kyiv, as far as they wanted to go. And the thing that we have made clear to them, and President Biden made clear to them before their February 2022 invasion, and he has made it clear to Russia every day since. And that's as long as he is president of the United States will stand with Ukraine because it's important to stand up for democracy when it's attacked by tyranny. And it's also important to the United States security, because if Russia is allowed to continue unchecked, they won't stop at Ukraine. They will continue to attack other democracies, other countries in Europe. And so it's important we stop them now. And I do think you always hear from allies
will the United States be there? And what we have shown to date is that we will be there. And I can tell you, as long as Joe Biden is the president, Tony Blinken is the secretary, that's where we'll continue to stand.
Matt Miller, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for carving out some time for us.
Thank you.
Let me bring Michael Crowley into this conversation. Michael Crowley, these are always international news events. This one has an added layer of keen interest among domestic audiences who may not normally tune in for a speech to NATO leaders. Your thoughts on what's gone into this speech tonight?
Well, Nicolle, thanks for having me. There are two different levels on which this speech is happening. Obviously, now one is the level that we would be experiencing were it not for President Biden's notorious debate performance. And I think the really core messages there are, number one, showing that NATO is strong and unified, and it's largely a message to Vladimir Putin, saying that, you think you can grind down Ukraine. You think you can wait out the West. You think that time is on your side, but it's not. Our resolve is not faltering. Our unity is solid. We're coming up with more and more resources for Ukraine, and we're not giving up. At the same time, I believe Matt's boss, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, I know, has said in the last couple of days, it's also an opportunity to try to explain to citizens of NATO countries what their money is paying for, why NATO is important, and what it is achieving, the kind of security that it's providing, and the defense of some of the values you've been talking about earlier, democracy and free societies. Then, of course, as I don't have to tell you, the other level on which this is all happening is a kind of performative aspect for President Biden to try to make up for the ground that he lost in that debate, to try to show that he's healthy, he's vigorous, and he's mentally acute. And I would just add that that is not only for a domestic political audience, but you better believe that the foreign leaders and diplomats who are here in Washington are watching him just as closely as you are, as political consultants and pollsters and Trump campaign advisors are. Everyone is sizing up President Biden, because for these NATO diplomats and leaders, they want to know what President Biden's prospects of reelection are. And they understand that a second Trump presidency could be hugely disruptive to NATO, hugely disruptive to transatlantic relations. And I think most of them, honestly, are hoping that President Biden nails it and he gets back on his feet. And they'll never say it publicly, but I believe that most of the leaders and diplomats here, with some notable exceptions we can talk about, including Mr. Orban, are pretty clearly hoping to see President Biden regain his stride, because they want continuity. They like where things are going with NATO, with U.S., European transatlantic relations, and they would like to see him be the Democratic nominee and win in November.
I mean, it's such a good point, Michael Crowley. This is, if you had to hope for a stage on which Joe Biden is the most comfortable, is the most Joe Biden, where his experience is an asset and his age is sort of secondary to that, this would be that event.
Yeah, it was kind of a running joke, Nicolle. When he was vice president, and then I think pretty sure when he was out of office, President Biden was still going to the Munich Security Conference, which is this kind of wonky gathering of European and U.S. security officials. And they talk about all these issues, the future of NATO, the future of Ukraine, transatlantic relations. And President Biden loved it. He would never stop going. And he knew everyone there. He was on first name basis with all these leaders and diplomats. And I really do think that this is his comfort zone. Look, he came of age during the Cold War. In many ways, he's kind of an old Cold warrior. Partly, I think, why he's really risen to this challenge against Russia and Vladimir Putin is that it puts a lot of those pieces back together. That transatlantic alliance, NATO versus Russia, the former Soviet Union. So this is his sweet spot. This is a language that he's fluent in. He loves it. And honestly, Nicolle, he ought to nail it today, because this is his comfort zone. And if he struggles when he's in such a comfort zone, that's an indication of a problem.
We are watching as they watch a video. Then I think there's someone ahead of President Joe Biden. We promise you will not miss a second of the president's address tonight. As New York Times reporter Michael Crowley is saying, this is President Joe Biden's crowd. This is President Joe Biden's comfort zone. And everybody in that room and the vast majority of Americans hoping that he nails it. We're going to sneak in a quick break as we continue to wait for these remarks to begin at the NATO summit in Washington. We'll bring you the speech in its entirety. For now, that quick break. We'll be right back.
His fascination with Putin, who of course is the adversary, really puts in question the viability of NATO. Now, this is, the problem with that, with these arrangements, is that once you undermine the trust in them, the language, you don't have to amend Article 5 of the NATO agreement. But once people feel that the United States cannot be counted on, is not consistent, and Trump actively seeks to undermine that confidence, then all sorts of terrible consequences can ensue. Dictators are encouraged.
We are back with Ian Bassin, Admiral Stavridis, and Michael Crowley. Admiral Stavridis, just elaborate on that point. What do autocrats and adversaries do in response to Trump's constant attacks on NATO?
Yeah, let me start with picking up something Mike said a moment ago about Joe Biden, and it gets to the heart of why alliances are more than just treaties and pieces of paper. They are the acts of nations, and they are the individuals who lead those nations. And I remember hosting a dinner at the Supreme Allied Commanders residence in Europe. I had all the ambassadors of all the NATO nations, and the guest was the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden. Vice President Biden went around the room, and to every one of those ambassadors, he would say something meaningful, personal, attached to the leader of that country. That level of experience, that bonded grip between the United States and our European allies was palpable in the room that night. So back to where we started this conversation, yes, the president needs to nail it tonight to continue to build and hold that trust. I think he will do so, and we'll know in a few moments. And final thought, as you alluded to, it's not just our allies who are listening. It is our enemies as well. People like Vladimir Putin, who blows up children's hospitals, puts medals on troops who commit war crimes, who has gone after the electric grid of Ukraine. These are all war crimes, Nicolle, and all indicative of the evil that this alliance has to continue to confront. And to do so most effectively, we need the bonds of trust at the strategic, the national, and indeed at the personal level. I think we'll see that on display over the next couple of days.
Ian, as everyone has sort of got their eyes and ears and heads in this summit, it feels dirty, right, to continue to introduce the choice that the American voter has in November. But everything we're looking at, this could be the last time we look at this again. I mean, Donald Trump is against NATO. Donald Trump refused to affirm America's commitment to Article 5, even though America is the only country in the alliance to ever cash out. He's so obsessed with cashing in and cashing out. We're the only ones to ever withdraw from that promise in the treaty. And this could never be something that happens in America again. NATO might go on, but it wouldn't celebrate in America if Donald Trump withdrew or sought to destroy NATO. And the celebration of Vladimir Putin that Donald Trump engages in on a near weekly basis, to think about the way he rewarded the soldiers who carried out the atrocities in Bucha, and I'm sure the ones who bombed a children's hospital in Kyiv will also be rewarded by Putin because he admires brutality. That's who's on the ballot. This guy, Joe Biden, who people are watching to see if he's vital enough, not whether his heart's in the right place or his policy is American or patriotic, but a guy who celebrates Vladimir Putin, who celebrates war crimes.
Well, whether NATO endures on the international stage and whether democracy endures in our domestic theater here at home, both hinge on the same fundamental challenge, which is whether you can hold a pro-democracy coalition together. Democracy is about bringing people together across differences and creating coalitions. You don't need coalitions so much under dictatorship or authoritarianism because that's just centralized, solidified power. But in democracies, you have to have coalitions. And one of the things that Joe Biden has done extremely well as president, one of his greatest achievements, has been solidifying the international coalition that is NATO and that is the liberal West. He has absolutely revitalized it in the early days here of the 21st century. And now he's facing the challenge at home of holding the pro-democracy coalition together here in the United States. And what we've seen over and over again, both at home and abroad, is that when the pro-democracy coalition holds together, it can and does defeat authoritarianism. But when it fractures, you see those illiberal and autocratic movements in places like Poland and Hungary and other countries ride to power on just plurality support. Here at home, the pro-democracy, anti-Trump coalition has been the strongest force in American politics for the last 7 years. It's either won or exceeded expectations in every election since 2016, including Joe Biden's victory in 2020. And he has been central to holding that coalition together. And right now, at a moment where that coalition is currently at odds with itself, it is another challenge for the president to step up and solve. He's got to hold the pro-democracy coalition at home together with the same talent and vigor and success he's done on the international stage.
Someone who is carrying a similar message to what you just did, Ian Bassin, is actually President Joe Biden's vice president, Kamala Harris. Everyone is watching her. We have a journalist in the room listening to her remarks. Let's listen in.
Trump's advisors have created a 900-page blueprint they're calling Project 2025, detailing everything else they plan to do in a second term, including a plan to cut Social Security, to repeal our $35 cap on insulin, to eliminate the Department of Education, and end programs like Head Start. And Project 2025 outlines a plan to limit access to contraception and for a nationwide abortion ban with or without an act of Congress. If implemented, this plan would be the latest attack in Donald Trump's full-on assault on reproductive freedom. And no, we will not. And remember, then President Donald Trump handpicked 3 members of the United States Supreme Court because he intended for them to undo the protections of Roe v. Wade. And as he intended, they did. Now, over 20 states have a Trump abortion ban, many with no exceptions, even for rape and incest. And Trump has not denied, much less shown remorse for his actions. Instead, he uses the word proudly, takes credit for overturning Roe. So make no mistake, if Trump gets the chance, he will sign a national abortion ban to outlaw abortion in every single state. But we are not going to let that happen. We are not going to let that happen because we trust women. Women know what's in their own best interest and don't need their government telling them what to do with their body. And when Congress passes a law that restores the reproductive freedoms of Roe, our President Joe Biden will sign it into
MSNBC's Lawrence O'Donnell.
When I was working in the Senate, I didn't realize that it's the perfect training for the job that I have now. Covering government, covering politics, the complexity of it all. Mastering the detail is crucial to being able to present anything that happens in Senate buildings or any of the other news centers that we have to focus on every day.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 p.m. Eastern on MSNBC.
ultimately, in this election, we each face a question. What kind of country do we want to live in? A country of freedom, compassion, and rule of law? Or a country of chaos, fear, and hate? And here's the thing, and I say this to a group of people who already know this. We each have the power. We have the power to answer this question. So if the Supreme Court says the laws do not apply to Donald Trump, if people like Mike Pence are not around to stand up to him, and if extremists in Congress continue to bow down to him, our last defense, our last line of defense is the ballot box. Our vote. In 2020 and 2022, it was the leaders in this room and in this community who showed the power of your voice and your vote. And in 2024, we need you to do it again. So today I ask, Nevada, are you ready to make your voices heard? Do we believe in freedom? Do we believe in opportunity? Do we believe in the promise of America? And are we ready to fight for it? And when we fight, we win. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Vice President Kamala Harris hitting all of the themes around which this election will turn: the extremism of the Republican ticket, the Donald Trump appointed Supreme Court taking away a woman's right to choose. This, Mike Memoli, joining us from the White House, is the split screen that this White House wants every day and needs, frankly, every day between now and Election Day.
Yeah, that's right, Nicolle. This is a campaign that at moments of political challenge has often tried to respond by raising the stakes of the election. And Vice President very clearly trying to do this by focusing on, number one, their potentially biggest domestic issue advantage in this race, which is the overturning of Roe versus Wade, the Dobbs decision. You heard the Vice President there very clearly once again predicting that a President Trump would sign a nationwide abortion ban if it were passed by a Republican Congress. She also, according to the prepared remarks, I don't believe if we did hear that in this excerpt, but earlier in her remarks, she was going to refer to that Supreme Court decision on immunity to say that Donald Trump wants to turn this country into a dictatorship, and the Supreme Court just said that they will let him do that. And so this is a message that's directly relevant to what we're about to hear from President Biden in a much less pointed, much less political way. But this summit that the president is hosting here in Washington of NATO leaders, marking the 75th anniversary, is not entirely coincidental in terms of the election calendar. The Biden campaign certainly knew that this was going to be happening on the eve of the Republican National Convention next week. President Biden has talked so often about how one of his proudest accomplishments in office so far is the way he was able to rally the world, rally so many of our allies in support of Ukraine, and how he has framed this moment in our history, in our global history, as one in which democracies versus autocracies are competing for global supremacy. So this was a moment in which the president and his team intended to showcase one of his greatest strengths in terms of his diplomatic resume. Often we have heard from the White House in response to questions about his age that with age comes wisdom and experience, and the experience he has been able to show, and you've been talking about it with your other great panelists, that he's been able to rally the world in the way he has, especially with regard to Ukraine, is a major accomplishment. But we obviously can't separate, as the White House has viewed this in the campaign, a series of major moments throughout the summer that began with the debate. Well, the spotlight on his performance now and the way in which he speaks and can command that audience of fellow world leaders is something that a lot of Democrats, especially here in Washington, members of Congress who had returned this week, who have, for the most part, rallied behind him. But we had another major defection just in the last hour. Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill from New Jersey, somebody with her own significant national security credentials and experience, saying that she believes that the president should reevaluate and perhaps not run for reelection. This is a moment of import for the president, as Democrats want to see him continue to show the strength that they believe he can still bring to this ticket.
Mike Memley, that reporting, obviously super important. I don't want to lose the thread, though, of Kamala Harris, because whatever happens, my view is this is a healthy process for the Democratic Party to engage in. I will support, personally, any alternative to Donald Trump. The 2 hours started with Michael Cohen saying, vote Democrat up and down the ticket if you don't want to live in a dictatorship. There is something remarkable about Kamala Harris in this moment. She's a prosecutor prosecuting a case against a convicted felon. And there's something so powerful, and then you could just hear her connecting in that room. I wonder, I know there's more press traveling with her, Mike Memley. Some of that is a product of the calendar. Some of that is a product of what you just described, the intense scrutiny on the campaign. Some of it, a president has to president, and the vice president is a normal political surrogate. But just tell me this moment for Kamala Harris, what that's like, according to the White House.
Yeah, absolutely. I just spent a few days on the road with the vice president right before the debate, as a matter of fact, and saw this firsthand. She gave that major speech in the Washington suburbs on the anniversary of the Dobbs decision, which this has been such a major part of her portfolio before she traveled to Arizona for a similar set of remarks, but also hitting immigration. It's obvious for anybody who's been following the course of her time in office, the fact that she has a much bigger platform in the administration now than she did certainly before the announcement of the president's plans to seek a second term. The Biden team aware of the fact that, yes, there would be questions around her age, and they thought it was important for the vice president to be elevated. This is a team of advisors around the president who were around Vice President Biden, who saw, and I spent a lot of time on Air Force Two in the 2012 campaign, just how important it was to have a strong vice president out there making the case consistently. But you hit on one of the big potential assets she brings to the table right now. She is a former prosecutor. She spent 6 years as the Attorney General of California. She was a DA in San Francisco. And there is great value in having her out doing exactly what she did. One of the events that I covered when I was on the road with her recently, she laid out almost the rap sheet of Donald Trump as she was talking about the abortion issue, but she did it in a very clever way, talking about how he sort of, in legal terms, admitted his guilt, a confession, she put it, as she was quoting him in his past statements on abortion and appointing Supreme Court justices who ultimately overturned that right nationwide, that constitutional guarantee. And so this is exactly the kind of case that's going to be part of her messaging going forward regardless. There are people who I have spoken to who, as we've discussed the potential future if Biden were to step aside, and of course I'm going to preface that by saying the president himself has made it clear he does not intend to do so, but that what we have often talked about as the Biden coalition of voters at this moment may be even more powerful as simply just an anti-Trump coalition. And without the potential distractions around Biden's age and whether he's up for the job, having the vice president then at the top of the ticket, potentially with somebody like Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina, who himself served 16 years as the Attorney General of North Carolina before, as he's now in his final year of 8 years as governor, would represent a strong ticket that a lot of Democrats like the idea of as simply making the final 119 days of this campaign one about prosecuting the case against Donald Trump and rallying a coalition of voters beyond the typical Democratic winning coalition to do just that.
I want to bring into our conversation the president of Reproductive Freedom for All, Minnie Timmaraju. Minnie, you are prosecuting the case against taking rights away from women. To hear Kamala Harris do it, whether she's at the top, whether she's where she is right now, is so effective. And I am thinking back to her taking apart Bill Barr and questioning. I mean, this is a position that she is very, very, very effective at. And sort of the way in that speech that we listened to, the way in the speech that Mike Memley talked about, her ability to prosecute a case against Trump and Trumpism, very powerful.
She's been the leading voice on reproductive freedom since the Dobbs decision. You know, with her lengthy experience from AG to U.S. Senator to VP, having Kamala Harris on this ticket is so incredibly important and powerful. Having her be the voice and the lead on prosecuting this case against Donald Trump as the person who decimated reproductive freedom, right? Appointed the supermajority of, activist judges who have really gutted our freedoms. So Kamala is so incredibly compelling. She's such an incredible asset to this ticket. But I also want to point out that event was a launch event for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders for Biden. And the base of this coalition is women and people of color. And she is not only embodying that, the enthusiasm you heard from that crowd, that's her base, that's her community. And it's just so important to get her out there with the people who are really driving the work and outside of D.C.
Well, I'm so glad you brought it back to that, because it isn't for any of us to decide, right, what the Democrats do. It's for the base of the Democratic Party to make those decisions. I will vote for whomever the wise people that make up the Democratic Party decide. Minnie, say more, though, about this split screen. You've got President Joe Biden sort of in his comfort zone. You've got Kamala Harris prosecuting the political case. Just say something about the stakes in your space and in the area of freedom more broadly.
Look, the day after the debate, not going to mince words, it was a tough one. Reproductive rights, health and justice leaders, we came out swinging. We're with this president. We were with this ticket. We know that this administration has done the most of any U.S. administration on reproductive freedom. We know that the Trump agenda, whether it's Project 2025 or even the really problematic party platform they put out that purports to soften itself on abortion, but actually does some really dangerous stuff around really advancing fetal personhood, treating embryos as people, which would gut contraceptive and IVF care, despite them saying the opposite in the platform. The split screen right now that we're seeing, it shows the president in his stature, in his seniority, in his credibility as a world leader, and the vice president on the stump really taking it to the people and really drawing this incredible contrast. Donald Trump cannot be trusted on a world stage. He is not respected internationally. And Kamala Harris is going to drive it home and bring it to the people.
President Joe Biden.
Good evening. Welcome. In 1949, leaders of 12 countries, including President Truman, came together in this very room. History was watching. It had been 4 years since the surrender of the Axis powers and the end of the most devastating war the world had ever known. Here, these 12 leaders gathered to make a sacred pledge to defend each other against aggression, provide their collective security, and to answer threats as one, because they knew to prevent future wars, to protect democracies, to lay the groundwork for lasting peace and prosperity, they needed a new approach. They needed to combine their strengths. They needed an alliance. And here they signed the Washington Treaty and created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the single greatest, most effective defense alliance in the history of the world. Mr. Secretary General, leaders of NATO countries, foreign and defense ministers, representatives from partner nations and the European Union, and members of Congress, distinguished guests, welcome to the 2024 NATO Summit. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to host you in this milestone year, to look back with pride at all we've achieved and look ahead to our shared future with strength and with resolve. Together, we rebuilt Europe from the ruins of war, held high the torch of liberty during long decades of the Cold War. When former adversaries became fellow democracies, we welcomed them into the alliance. When war broke out in the Balkans, we intervened to restore peace and stop ethnic cleansing. And when the United States was attacked on September 11th, our NATO allies, all of you, stood with us, invoking Article 5 for the first time in NATO history, treating an attack on us as an attack on all of us. A breathtaking display of friendship that the American people will never, ever, ever forget. Through all this history, when great changes occurred, people would ask, can NATO adapt? And every time we proved we could adapt, and we did, evolving our strategies to stay ahead of threats, reaching out to new partners to increase our effectiveness. And here with us today are countries from the Indo-Pacific region. They're here because they have a stake in our success, and we have a stake in theirs. Today, NATO is more powerful than ever, 32 nations strong. For years, Finland and Sweden were among our closest partners. Now they have chosen to officially join NATO, and because of the power and meaning of Article 5 guarantee, that's the reason. It was the most important aspect of the alliance in 1949, and it is still the most important aspect. I'd also note, Finland and Sweden joined the alliance not just because their leaders sought it, because their citizens called for it in overwhelming numbers. Remember, NATO's character is fundamentally democratic, always has been and always must continue to be. And today, NATO is better resourced than it ever has been. I want to pause on this because it's significant. In the year 2020, the year I was elected president, only 9 NATO allies are spending 2% of their defense GDP on defense. This year, 23 will spend at least 2%. And some will spend more than that. And the remaining countries that have not yet reached that milestone will get there soon. This remarkable progress, proof that our commitment is broad and deep, that we're ready, that we're willing, we're able to deter aggression and defend every inch of NATO territory across every domain: land, air, sea, cyber, and space. My friends, it's good that we're stronger than ever, because this moment in history calls for our collective strength. Autocrats want to overturn global order, which is by and large kept for nearly 80 years and counting. Terrorist groups continue to plot evil schemes to cause mayhem and chaos and suffering. In Europe, Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine continues, and Putin wants nothing less than Ukraine's total subjugation, to end Ukraine's democracy, to destroy Ukraine's culture, and to wipe Ukraine off the map. And we know Putin won't stop at Ukraine. But make no mistake, Ukraine can and will stop Putin. Especially with our full collective support. They have our full support. Even before Russian bombs were falling in Ukraine, the alliance acted. I ordered the U.S. reinforcements at NATO's eastern flank. More troops, more aircraft, more capabilities. And now the United States has more than 100,000 troops on the continent of Europe. NATO moves swiftly as well, not only reinforcing the 4 existing battle groups in the east, but also adding 4 more in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia, essentially doubling NATO's strength on the eastern flank. Together, we've built a global coalition to stand with Ukraine. Together, we provided significant economic and humanitarian assistance. And together, we've supplied Ukraine with weapons it needs to defend itself. Tanks, armored fighting vehicles, air defense systems, long-range missiles, and millions of munitions. The United States, nearly 24 allied partners, have signed bilateral security agreements with Ukraine. And more countries will follow. Today, I'm announcing the historic donation of air defense equipment for Ukraine. The United States, Germany, the Netherlands, Romania, and Italy will provide Ukraine with the equipment for 5 additional strategic air defense systems. And in the coming months, the United States and our partners intend to provide Ukraine with dozens of additional tactical air defense systems. The United States will make sure that when we export critical air defense interceptors, Ukraine goes to the front of the line. They will get this assistance before anyone else gets it. All told, Ukraine will receive hundreds of additional interceptors over the next year, helping protect Ukrainian cities against Russian missiles, Ukrainian troops facing air attacks on their front lines. Make no mistake, Russia is failing in this war. More than 2 years into Putin's war of choice, his losses are staggering. More than 350,000 Russian troops dead or wounded. Nearly 1 million Russians, many of them young people, have left Russia because they no longer see a future in Russia. And Kyiv, remember, fellas and ladies, supposed to fall in 5 days, remember? Was still standing 2.5 years later and will continue to stand. All of we allies knew that before this war, Putin thought NATO would break. Today, NATO is stronger than it's ever been in its history. When this senseless war began, Ukraine was a free country. Today, it is still a free country. And the war will end with Ukraine remaining a free and independent country. Russia will not prevail. Ukraine will prevail. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a pivotal moment for Europe, for the transatlantic community, and I might add for the world. Let's remember, the fact that NATO remains the bulwark of global security did not happen by accident. It wasn't inevitable. Again and again at critical moments, we chose unity over disunion, progress over retreat, freedom over tyranny, hope over fear. Again and again, we stood behind our shared vision of a peaceful and prosperous transatlantic community. Here at this summit, we gather to proclaim NATO is ready and able to secure that vision today and well into the future. Let me say this. An overwhelming bipartisan majority of Americans understand that NATO makes us all safer. The fact that both Democratic and Republican parties are represented here today is a testament to that fact. The American people know that all the progress we've made in the past 75 years has happened behind the shield of NATO. And the American people understand what would happen if there was no NATO. Another war in Europe, American troops fighting and dying, dictators spreading chaos, economic collapse, catastrophes. Americans, they know we're stronger with our friends. And we understand this is a sacred obligation. As President Reagan put it, and I quote, "If our fellow democracies are not secure, we cannot be secure. If you are threatened, we are threatened. If you're not at peace, we cannot be at peace." Reagan knew it then, and we know it now. Our nations will continue to keep faith with what we pledged in years to come. Now, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to end my remarks in a slightly unusual way. NATO is an alliance of nations, but also made up of leaders. And one person in particular has done an extraordinary job leading NATO for the last decade. Secretary General Stoltenberg, would he come forward? So much of the progress we made in the alliance is thanks to the Secretary. He's a man of integrity and intellectual rigor, a calm temperament in a moment of crisis, a consummate diplomat who works with leaders across the political spectrum and always finds a way to keep us moving forward. Secretary, you've guided this alliance through one of the most consequential periods in its history. I realize, I was talking to your wife, I personally asked you to extend your service. Forgive me. and you put your own plans on hold. When the Russia war in Ukraine began, you didn't hesitate. Today, NATO is stronger, smarter, and more energized than when you began. And 1 billion people across Europe and North America, indeed the whole world, will reap the rewards of your labor for years to come in the form of security, opportunity, and greater freedom. For these reasons, I'm pleased to award you the highest civilian honor the United States can bestow, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Ask the military to come forward. I'm asking to read the citation.
The President of the United States of America awards this Presidential Medal of Freedom to Jens Stoltenberg. A visionary statesman and ceaseless defender of democracy, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has guided the NATO alliance through the most consequential decade for European security since World War II. When Vladimir Putin launched his brutal assault on the people of Ukraine, betting that NATO would break, Secretary General Stoltenberg proved him wrong. Under his stewardship, NATO has become stronger and more united than ever, and Americans for generations to come will benefit from the safer world he helped create. He demonstrates that the core truth of the alliance is as powerful now as it was 75 years ago. Together, we are stronger.
President Joe Biden, with a rather soaring speech there, the news of bestowing the Presidential Medal of Freedom on NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Let me bring back into our coverage NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memley and New York Times diplomatic correspondent Michael Crowley. Michael Crowley, your thoughts?
Well, I thought it was a strong and smooth performance by President Biden. On the substance, he articulated why NATO is riding high right now, why the alliance is feeling strength and confidence on its 75th anniversary, and a kind of a nice little piece of stagecraft there. I think that people are very grateful for the work that the outgoing Secretary General has done. So I think that was a nice touch. It probably resonated well in the room. And I will leave it to your political analysts to talk about how, Biden looked and sounded. But I have to say, my guess would be that the White House was pretty happy with the way he came across. He spoke pretty smoothly. And that little exchange at the end showed him in motion, and I thought was pretty effective.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Memley, this is, have you been on campaigns? You want to string together 119 days just like today.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Nicolle. President Biden cares so much, not just about what he says, but about how he says it. I've talked over the years to a number of his speechwriters, and I think not to be lost as there have been questions about why some of the response to the debate maybe didn't happen as quickly and as forcefully as other Democrats would have liked. You can see it on display right now, the president having spent so much time over the last week preparing for this summit, probably putting a lot of time and thought into these remarks. And I was just so fascinated to hear the different audiences that the president was speaking to in his remarks, speaking to our adversaries, certainly to Russia, as he was announcing a new major commitment on the part of the U.S. and some of our key European allies to provide new Patriot missile systems, battery systems to Ukraine as they continue to fight Russian aggression. You also heard him speaking to our allies, trying to reassure them that the Biden administration's continued and stalwart support for NATO is not unique to his administration, but also is one that is shared by many Republicans, even if not necessarily clearly by the Republican nominee. And then you saw him speaking to an American political audience as well. This is the second time in just about less than a month we've heard President Biden invoke Ronald Reagan. He did so in Normandy with that speech at Pointe du Hoc, evoking one of Ronald Reagan's major speeches in the same location, as he was trying to cast the bipartisan spirit of this foreign policy at this moment, as he's looking for re-election this fall.
Michael Crowley, Mike Memoli, we cannot do it without you. Thank you both for sticking around for some extra minutes. We're grateful to you for that. And thanks to all of you for letting us into your homes during these truly extraordinary times. We are grateful.
Saturday, September 7th, Brooklyn, New York. It's MSNBC Live Democracy 2024, our premier live audience event. Maddow, Psaki, Mitchell, Reed, Hayes, Steele, Menendez, Sanders-Townsend, O'Donnell, Wagner, Rule, Melber, Kornacki, and more. Join the MSNBC community in conversation. Visit msnbc.com/democracy2024 to buy your tickets today.